Before the foundation of the earth was laid, before time itself began to tick like a cold, relentless cosmic clock, a catastrophic fracture tore through the highest dimensions of reality. We have been conditioned to picture the war in heaven as a chaotic clash of feathered wings and gleaming swords, a medieval battlefield painted in simplistic strokes of light and shadow. But the ancient texts reveal a sequence of events far more terrifying and complex. This was not a primitive war of physical weapons. It was a war of legal dominion, a structural rebellion against the very architecture of existence. Ezekiel chapter 28 verse 14 provides a chilling, surgical glimpse into the epicenter of this fracture. It speaks of an entity of unfathomable power and beauty, stating, "You were the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked back and forth in the midst of fiery stones." This was not a monstrous red-horned beast lurking in a cavern. The Hebrew text does not describe a monster, but a guardian of the divine throne, an entity of pure celestial engineering positioned at the very apex of creation. In the ancient Near Eastern context, the mountain of God and the fiery stones do not represent a literal mountain range, but the ultimate cosmic sanctuary, the operational control room of the universe. The Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically the fragmented and deeply mysterious manuscripts known as the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, describe this heavenly court not as a peaceful congregation resting on white clouds, but as a terrifying mechanized hierarchy. They describe angelic priesthoods, spinning wheels of fire, and entities composed entirely of blistering light and terrifying intelligence. To rebel in this environment was not a simple act of moral disobedience. It was an attempt to hijack the operational core of reality itself. Isaiah chapter 14 gives us the precise identity and the crime of this being. "How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the dawn." The original Hebrew phrase used in the ancient scrolls is Helel ben Shahar, a shining one, a light bearer. We know him as Lucifer. His rebellion was an infection of pride, a systemic, parasitic virus introduced into a flawless divine order. He did not simply want to be free from God's rule. He wanted to sit on the Mount of Assembly, to permanently rewrite the laws of the universe in his own twisted image. And as this celestial treason unfolded, as a third of the stars of heaven were violently swept away in the ensuing cosmic insurrection, a profound and deeply unsettling question emerges from the text. Where was Christ? Modern theology often isolates Jesus strictly to the New Testament, viewing him merely as the compassionate carpenter from Nazareth, born under a Roman census. But Orthodox ancient theology and the raw scriptures demand a far more expansive and terrifying view of the Son of God. In the Gospel of John, we are told that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He is the Logos. In ancient Greek philosophy and early Christian theology, the Logos is not merely a spoken syllable or a passive concept. It is the active, divine intellect that orders the cosmos. It is the sovereign, binding logic that prevents all matter and spirit from instantly disintegrating into absolute chaos. Colossians chapter 1, verse 17 states explicitly that he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. The original Greek word used by Paul is sunastikon, meaning to cohere, to be locked into structural perfection by an invisible, unbreakable force. Therefore, during the greatest and most violent rebellion the universe has ever witnessed, Christ was not absent. He was not waiting in the wings of eternity for a human body to be prepared. He was there. The Logos was present as Lucifer, the shining cherub, began to corrupt his own breathtaking wisdom. Christ watched in absolute sovereign silence as the infection of sin birthed itself in the heart of the highest angel. Why did the Creator, who actively held the very fabric of Lucifer's existence together, simply watch as the rebellion festered? Why didn't the Word speak a single devastating syllable to annihilate the uprising before it could fracture the angelic ranks and doom humanity? This silent watch is perhaps the most deeply disturbing and profoundly misunderstood mystery of the biblical narrative. It is a mystery that forces us to re-examine the terrifying sovereignty of God, the exact brutal nature of the war in heaven, and the cold, unyielding mechanics of divine justice. If you seek the hidden truths of the ancient world, if you demand to understand the dark and unspoken realities of the scriptures without the comforting filters of modern tradition, subscribe and join us in this investigation. We are about to step into the primordial darkness, back to the exact moment the fiery stones of the cosmic mountain first cracked. The silence of the Logos during the fall of the day star was not an act of passivity. It was a calculated, terrifying allowance. And to understand what was actually happening in the shadows of the divine throne room, we must completely dismantle everything you thought you knew about the angelic realm. To understand the catastrophic silence of the word during this cosmic treason, we must first completely shatter the modern hallucinations that have pacified our understanding of the spiritual realm. For centuries, Western tradition, heavily influenced by Renaissance art and medieval poetry, has fed us a deeply sanitized, almost childish depiction of the heavens. We have been trained to imagine angels as effeminate humans with swan wings, playing harps on floating clouds, existing in a state of passive, unbroken tranquility. We imagine the devil as a grotesque, red-skinned monster ruling over a subterranean cavern of fire. These images are theological pacifiers. They are comfortable fictions designed to shield the human mind from the terrifying, hyper-complex reality of the biblical cosmos. The ancient Israelites, the prophets who originally penned these texts, would be utterly horrified by our modern depictions. To the ancient Near Eastern mind, the spiritual realm was not a choir of floating pacifists. It was a heavily militarized, fiercely structured, administrative empire. It was a bureaucracy of cosmic terror, governed by strict jurisdictional laws and populated by entities of unfathomable power and terrifying geometry. To grasp the political environment in which Lucifer's rebellion fermented, we must look to the archaeological dust of the ancient world. In the late 1920s, archaeologists excavating the ancient city of Ugarit, located in modern-day Syria, unearthed thousands of clay tablets. These texts, written in a language closely related to biblical Hebrew, revealed the religious and cosmic framework of the ancient Canaanites. They described a pantheon, a divine council of lesser deities ruled by a supreme creator God. When we cross-reference this ancient Near Eastern context with the raw text of the Hebrew Bible, a staggering parallel emerges. The biblical authors deliberately used this cultural language, not to endorse paganism, but to explain the true, terrifying reality of Yahweh's administration. The God of the Bible does not rule the universe alone in a vacuum. He rules it through a decentralized, highly organized senate of spiritual beings. Look at the explosive opening of Psalm 82. The text reads, "God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods." In the original Hebrew, this sentence is a linguistic earthquake. The word used for the supreme God is Elohim, and the exact same word, Elohim, is used for the lesser gods he is judging. This is not polytheism, and it is not a metaphor for human judges, as some fragile modern theologies attempt to argue. In the ancient Hebrew mindset, the word Elohim is not a specific name. It is a classification. It is a description of residence. It simply means an entity that inhabits the spiritual realm, just as the word human denotes an entity that inhabits the physical plane. Yahweh is an Elohim, but no other Elohim is Yahweh. He is the uncreated creator, but he placed millions of created Elohim in an administrative assembly, a divine council, delegating to them jurisdictional authority over the mechanics of the cosmos, the movements of the stars, and the governance of the celestial realms. The book of 1 Kings, chapter 22, pulls back the curtain on this terrifying boardroom. The prophet Micaiah experiences a vision where he sees Yahweh sitting on his throne with all the multitudes of heaven standing around him, on his right and on his left. The text describes a literal debate. God asks the council a question, and these non-human entities deliberate. They offer different strategies. They possess free will, independent intellect, and the capacity to govern. The war in heaven was not a spontaneous, chaotic riot. It was a constitutional crisis within this exact council. It was a calculated political coup within the supreme senate of the universe. And at the very center of this divine administration was the entity we call Lucifer. To understand his rebellion, we must understand his anatomy and his original function. Ezekiel chapter 28 explicitly titles him the Anointed Cherub who covers. The Western mind hears the word cherub and imagines a winged baby. But if you examine the ancient iconography of Babylon, Assyria, and Egypt, the cherubim, derived from the Akkadian word karibu, were the ultimate security apparatus of the divine presence. They were terrifying hybrid chimeras, often depicted with the massive bodies of bulls or lions, the predatory wings of eagles, and the faces of men. They were stationed at the entrances of sacred temples to violently repel the profane. To be the covering cherub meant that Lucifer was the supreme guardian of the throne of God. He was the highest-ranking military and administrative official in the celestial hierarchy. Furthermore, the ancient texts do not draw a sharp, neat line between the varying classes of the heavenly host. The prophet Isaiah describes the seraphim surrounding the throne. The Hebrew root word is saraph, which translates literally to a burning, venomous serpent. These entities are towering, serpentine pillars of blistering radioactive fire, vibrating with such intensity that the physical foundations of the temple shake at their voices. When we arrive at Genesis chapter 3, the creature that tempts humanity in the garden is called the Nachash. We translate it lazily as serpent. But in ancient Hebrew, Nachash is a remarkably complex root word that functions simultaneously as a noun, a verb, and an adjective. As a noun, it means a serpent. As a verb, it means to practice divination, to whisper enchantments, or to hiss. And as an adjective, it means the shining one, or the one of luminous bronze. Lucifer was the Nachash. He was not a talking snake hanging from a tree branch. He was the shining serpentine guardian, a being of blinding luminosity and lethal intellect, constructed from the fiery stones of the cosmic mountain. He was stationed in Eden. And to understand his fall, we must completely redefine Eden itself. The book of Ezekiel proves that Eden was not merely a lush, primitive jungle located somewhere in Mesopotamia where two naked humans ate forbidden fruit. Ezekiel 28 verses 13 and 14 state clearly, "You were in Eden, the garden of God. You were on the holy mountain of God." In ancient cosmic geography, mountains were the precise locations where heaven and earth intersected. Mountains were the literal temples of the gods. Eden was the cosmic peak, the supreme sanctuary where the spiritual and physical dimensions overlapped perfectly. It was the command center of the new human creation, and Lucifer, the shining cherub, was its chief operational director. He was the high priest of the cosmic temple, adorned with every precious stone, ruby, topaz, emerald, chrysolite, onyx, and jasper, settings perfectly engineered in gold on the very day he was created. He was the most flawless piece of living machinery God had ever spoken into existence. So why did he rebel? What could possibly motivate a being of supreme intelligence, dwelling in the absolute perfection of the divine presence, to commit the ultimate cosmic suicide? The answer is not mere vanity. It was a hyper-intelligent, calculated legal dispute over jurisdiction and hierarchy. The book of Hebrews, chapter 2, verse 5, reveals a staggering truth that operates as the hidden engine of the entire biblical narrative. It is not to angels that he has subjected the world to come. When God created humanity, he executed a decree that shook the angelic council to its absolute core. He took the lowest form of matter, the dirt of the earth, and breathed his own uncreated spirit into it. And then he commanded these fragile, biological creatures to rule. He gave dominion of the physical plane, the newly minted earth, to mankind. Furthermore, humanity was created in the Imago Dei, the image of God, a status never explicitly granted to the angelic host. For the covering cherub, an entity composed of pure light, fire, and supreme, ancient intellect, the idea of serving, guiding, and ultimately submitting to a creature made of mud was an absolute theological offense. It was a disruption of the natural hierarchy of power. Lucifer looked at humanity and saw weakness, biological frailty, and profound ignorance. He looked at himself and saw perfect wisdom, blistering beauty, and age-old authority. The rebellion was born out of a perceived cosmic injustice. Lucifer did not simply want to be evil for the sake of evil. He wanted to correct what he viewed as a fatal flaw in God's administrative design. He believed he was the rightful ruler of the new creation. This is the true, terrifying context of Isaiah chapter 14, which records the internal monologue of the Shining One as the treason finalized in his mind. We must dissect his declaration of war carefully. Lucifer makes 5 specific, legally binding decrees, known as the 5 I wills. He says, "I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the Mount of Assembly, on the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High." Notice the precision of his demands. This is the language of a political coup. The stars of God in ancient Near Eastern literature are not burning balls of gas in the night sky. They are the lesser Elohim, the members of the divine council. Lucifer is stating his explicit intention to stage a hostile takeover within the Supreme Senate. He intends to raise his throne above his peers. He specifically mentions the Mount of Assembly on the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. In Ugaritic Canaanite texts, Mount Zaphon was the literal geographical mountain where the storm god Baal held his divine council. The biblical prophet Isaiah is deliberately using the most terrifying mythological language of the ancient world to explain a literal spiritual reality. Lucifer was attempting to usurp the operational apparatus of the universe. When he says, "I will make myself like the Most High," he is not threatening to replace the uncreated essence of God. He knows he is a created being. He is threatening to seize the administrative function of God. He wants the seat of absolute authority. He wants to be the supreme CEO of existence. As this cosmic insurrection was actively being plotted in the highest echelons of the angelic senate, as the shining cherub whispered his enchantments, his nachash, and convinced 1/3 of the celestial military that God was withholding their rightful power, we are forced back to the ultimate haunting question. Where was the Logos? Where was Christ? The modern church operates under the subtle assumption that Jesus only appears in the New Testament, stepping onto the stage of history in a manger in Bethlehem. But ancient Jewish theology, centuries before the birth of Christianity, recognized a profound and deeply mysterious reality in the Hebrew Scriptures. They identified a theology known as the 2 powers in heaven. Ancient rabbis and scholars read texts where Yahweh is described as invisible, reigning from the highest heaven. Yet simultaneously, Yahweh is walking on the earth, eating a meal with Abraham in Genesis 18, or wrestling physically with Jacob in the desert. They recognized a specific, terrifying figure known as the Malach Yahweh, the angel of the Lord. But this was no ordinary angelic messenger. In Exodus chapter 23, God gives a severe warning to Moses regarding this specific angel. He says, "Pay attention to him and listen to what he says. Do not rebel against him. He will not forgive your rebellion, since my name is in him." In the ancient world, to carry the exact name of a sovereign was to carry his exact essence, his full authority, and his identical identity. This visible manifestation of the invisible God, this supreme commander of the armies of heaven, who accepts human worship and speaks with the unmediated authority of Yahweh. This is the pre-incarnate Christ. This is the Logos, the Word who was with God and who was God. Therefore, during the genesis of the rebellion, Christ was not distant. He was not a passive observer watching from another dimension. He was sitting at the very apex of the divine council, the Logos, the binding architecture of reality, in whom all things hold together, was physically and intensely present in the spiritual realm as the treason fomented. Imagine the sheer, suffocating terror of this scene. The Word of God, possessing omniscient intellect, watched the Nachash build his coalition in the shadows. He listened as the 5 treasonous decrees were silently formulated in the prideful heart of the covering cherub. He observed as 1/3 of the Elohim, billions of ancient, powerful entities shifted their allegiance from the Creator to the Guardian. As the absolute sovereign, Christ possessed the instantaneous power to unmake Lucifer before a single act of defiance was committed. With a single thought, a microscopic exertion of will, he could have collapsed the cherub's luminous existence back into the absolute nothingness from which he was forged. He could have severed the cosmic coordinates of the rebel angels and deleted them from the fabric of eternity, saving humanity from thousands of years of bloodshed, disease, and demonic torment. He could have ended the war before it began. And yet, the Logos remained entirely silent. The sovereign intellect of the universe did not strike. He allowed the infection to spread. He permitted the treason to manifest from a thought into a dimensional war that would eventually crash violently onto the shores of the physical earth. Why would a holy, omnipotent God allow the architecture of his own throne room to be desecrated? Why let the virus live and spread to the newly created humans in Eden? The answer lies in the terrifying, razor-thin distinction between absolute power and absolute authority. It is a distinction between the actions of a cosmic dictator and the requirements of a perfectly just, legal courtroom. It is a mystery that has been systematically buried by centuries of soft theology, and it is the very key to understanding why the war in heaven could never be won by sheer force alone. To comprehend why the sovereign architect of the universe stayed his hand and permitted the highest echelons of his administration to fracture, we must discard our mortal understanding of warfare. When humanity goes to war, the conflict is inherently kinetic. We rely on the physical displacement of matter. We forge weapons of iron, ignite chemical explosives, and orchestrate the crude collision of biological bodies until one side is bled into submission. Because we are bound by the relentless restrictions of gravity, time, and physical vulnerability, our wars are fought in the dirt. But to an entity composed of pure celestial energy, a being existing entirely outside the suffocating constraints of the space-time continuum, physical violence is an absolute impossibility. An immortal spirit cannot be stabbed. A being constructed of blazing, multi-dimensional fire cannot be suffocated or crushed. Therefore, the war in heaven described in the apocalyptic texts was not a chaotic melee of swinging swords and clashing armor. It was an event far more terrifying, complex, and sophisticated. It was a war of jurisdiction. It was a hyper-intelligent, systemic legal assault upon the foundational laws of reality itself. The conflict was fought in the theater of truth and cosmic jurisprudence. We find the blueprint for this incomprehensible conflict in the book of Revelation, chapter 12, verse 7, which states simply that war broke out in heaven, and Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The original Greek text uses the word polemos for war. In ancient military strategy, a polemos was not a brief, chaotic skirmish or a single bloody battle. It was a prolonged, calculated campaign, a war of ideals, propaganda, and strategic positioning designed to utterly dismantle the opponent's infrastructure. Lucifer, in his blinding pride, did not attempt to punch God. He attempted to legally outmaneuver him. He sought to prove to the divine council that God's decree regarding humanity was fundamentally unjust, and that he, the shining cherub, possessed a superior administrative logic. This forces us into the cold, terrifying reality of the heavenly courtroom. God is not depicted in the ancient texts merely as a king sitting on a cushioned throne, arbitrarily dispensing favors and wrath. He is the supreme magistrate. He is the ultimate judge, presiding over a flawless cosmic legal system. And the most terrifying attribute of a truly perfect judge is that he is bound by his own laws. If God had simply reacted to Lucifer's internal treason with an instant, violent display of omnipotence, if he had simply obliterated the rebel cherub the millisecond the thought of rebellion manifested, he would have ruled as a cosmic tyrant, relying on raw, brute force rather than supreme justice. To destroy Lucifer without a trial, without allowing the rebellion to legally demonstrate its own inherent bankruptcy, would have validated Lucifer's claim. It would have proven to the billions of observing angelic entities that God's kingdom was maintained not by righteousness and perfect structural design, but by the threat of instant annihilation. So the Logos, the intellectual foundation of the universe, sat in absolute silence and allowed the courtroom to convene. He permitted the treason to formalize. This introduces one of the most profoundly disturbing realities of the ancient biblical narrative, a reality that completely shatters the fragile, comfortable theology of the modern era. Lucifer was not immediately cast into a burning cavern. He maintained his administrative access. The Book of Job, one of the oldest texts in the biblical canon, provides a terrifying window into the mechanics of this ongoing spiritual parliament. In chapter 1, verse 6, we are given a stark, horrifying report. The text reads, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them." The phrase sons of God is derived from the ancient Hebrew term Bene Elohim. These are the highest-ranking members of the divine council, ancient celestial governors reporting directly to the supreme magistrate, and walking brazenly among them into the very throne room of the uncreated Creator is the entity we know as the devil. But the original Hebrew text does not use his name. It uses a title. The text refers to him as, "Hey Satan." In the legal vocabulary of the ancient Near East, the Satan was not a grotesque monster. It was an official court role. It translates directly to the adversary, the accuser, or the prosecuting attorney. Lucifer had retained a legal function within the divine bureaucracy. He was permitted to stand in the blazing presence of God, observing humanity, finding our biological and spiritual flaws, and prosecuting us before the supreme court of the universe. He was operating within the terrifying parameters of a legal system that God himself had established and refused to violate. The rebellion, therefore, was not a singular, contained event confined to the ancient past. The silence of the Logos allowed the infection to become a cascading cosmic failure, a malignant virus that relentlessly sought new vectors of attack. When Lucifer realized he could not overthrow the uncreated essence of the supreme magistrate in the highest heavens, he shifted his focus to the weakest point in God's administrative design. He turned his terrifying age-old intellect toward the mud creatures. He targeted humanity. By whispering his enchantments in the garden, by introducing the concept of autonomy and sin to Adam and Eve, Lucifer successfully staged a jurisdictional coup on the physical earth. He legally hijacked the dominion that God had originally granted to mankind. This catastrophic transfer of authority is precisely why Jesus himself, during his earthly ministry in the Gospel of John, chapter 12, verse 31, explicitly refers to the devil as the ruler of this world. It is why the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, refers to him as the God of this age. These are not poetic metaphors. They are statements of terrifying legal fact. The covering cherub had successfully conquered the earthly province of the cosmic empire. But the horror of the ancient world did not stop with the fall in Eden. The infection of rebellion spread deeper into the ranks of the divine council, leading to a secondary, far more grotesque insurrection that the modern church has aggressively attempted to bury. To understand the sheer immensity of the demonic footprint on earth, we must step outside the sanitized borders of modern tradition and look at the ancient texts that the earliest Christians and the Jewish scholars held in absolute reverence. We must open the Book of Enoch. Discovered among the dead, dry caves of Qumran, preserved for millennia alongside the canonical scriptures in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the first book of Enoch was considered essential reading by the early church fathers. The biblical apostle Jude even quotes directly from it in the New Testament. Enoch pulls back the veil on a catastrophic spiritual incursion that occurred in the days of Noah, detailing the terrifying events briefly summarized in Genesis chapter 6. Genesis records a bizarre, chilling anomaly. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. It goes on to state that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. For centuries, Fearful theologians have tried to explain this away as a mere intermingling of righteous and unrighteous human bloodlines. But the ancient Near Eastern audience understood exactly what this text meant, and the Book of Enoch provides the horrifying forensic details. The text describes a specific class of angels known in the Aramaic fragments as the Irin. We translate this conceptually as the Watchers. These were towering, unsleeping celestial sentinels, entities originally assigned by the divine council to observe and guide the developing human race. They were stationed at the invisible boundary, separating the spiritual dimension from the physical plane. But as the Logos watched in his terrifying, unyielding silence, 200 of these high-ranking watchers abandoned their assigned habitation. Enoch details the exact geographical coordinates of this cosmic breach. The watchers descended upon the summit of Mount Hermon. This is not a mythical location. Mount Hermon is a massive, snow-capped mountain cluster located in the modern-day anti-Lebanon mountain range, bordering Syria and Israel. In the ancient world, this specific region was known as Bashan, historically universally regarded as the geographic gateway to the underworld, a place utterly saturated in dark, serpentine mythology. It was the epicenter of demonic geography. Upon the icy peaks of Mount Hermon, the leader of this rogue faction, a devastatingly powerful entity named Semyaza, gathered his 200 captains. He knew that the penalty for breaching the dimensional barrier and physically interacting with the human domain was absolute, irrevocable damnation. Enoch chapter 6 records Semyaza's hesitation, his fear that his subordinates would abandon him to face the wrath of the supreme magistrate alone. And so, upon the summit of the mountain, the 200 watchers bound themselves together through a dark, binding ritual. They swore a mutual imprecation. They forged a cosmic blood pact, tying their eternal destinies to a singular, horrific objective. They agreed to genetically and technologically hijack the human race. The Watchers did not merely descend to satisfy a base, fleshly lust. They descended to commit an act of ultimate cosmic sabotage. They initiated a severe illicit transfer of restricted celestial technology to primitive human minds. The Book of Enoch provides a terrifying inventory of this forbidden knowledge. An entity named Azazel taught humanity the metallurgy of heaven. He taught men how to extract iron and bronze from the earth, how to forge swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. Before this moment, human conflict was primitive and localized. Azazel introduced the machinery of mass slaughter. He taught them the art of warfare. Other watchers taught mankind the secrets of astrology, the mapping of the stars to predict and manipulate the future. They taught root cuttings, the extraction of chemical compounds from the earth to create poisons, hallucinogens, and pharmaceutical sorcery. They taught the women how to forge cosmetics, how to paint their eyes with antimony to project a seductive, supernatural allure. This was not human evolution. This was a catastrophic, demonic download. The Watchers took the sacred, complex mechanisms of the cosmos and weaponized them in the hands of a corrupt biological species. They accelerated human civilization into a hyper-violent, sorcerous nightmare. But the most devastating crime committed on Mount Hermon was biological. The Watchers, entities possessing the ability to manipulate their spiritual form into physical, tangible matter, bypassed the genetic firewall established by God in Genesis chapter 1. They mated with human women. The resulting offspring were not mere men. They were the Nephilim. The Hebrew root of this word carries the concept of the fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. These were biological abominations, monstrous, towering hybrids, possessing a horrifying amalgamation of angelic strength and human depravity. They were not created in the Imago Dei. They were an unauthorized species, violent, ravenous titans that rapidly consumed the resources of the ancient world. When the food ran out, Enoch records that they turned their insatiable hunger toward humanity itself, plunging the earth into a state of absolute, cannibalistic terror. The spiritual ecosystem of the earth was completely shattered. The architecture of human flesh, designed to perfectly house the breath of God, was hopelessly polluted by angelic DNA. The rebellion of Lucifer, once confined to the high, invisible chambers of the divine council, had physically mutated into a planetary infestation of giants, blood magic, and mechanized warfare. And still, the question echoes through the silent corridors of eternity. Where was the Logos? The silence of God in the face of this absolute horror drives us to the very edge of theological sanity. Why did the Supreme Magistrate allow the Watchers to descend? Why did he permit Azazel to hand the blueprint of the sword to a frail human mind? We must understand that God's justice is not a panicked reaction. It is a slow, methodical, and utterly inescapable grinding of cosmic gears. The Logos allowed the earthly corruption to reach its absolute zenith, so that the legal case against the rebel angels would be sealed for all of eternity. He allowed them to demonstrate, physically and irrefutably, that their governance leads only to absolute chaos, suffering, and the consumption of flesh. He gave them enough rope to hang themselves upon the gallows of cosmic law. When the cries of humanity finally reached the threshold of the divine council, the silence of the Logos broke. But he did not break it with a whisper of forgiveness. He broke it with a decree of absolute, terrifying judgment. The Apostle Peter, in his second epistle, chapter 2, verse 4, documents the terrifying judicial response of God. He writes, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment." To read this verse in standard English is to completely miss the terrifying geographical reality of the text. The English translators use the word hell, lazily grouping all concepts of the afterlife into a single, fiery location. But the Apostle Peter, deeply educated in ancient Greek philosophy and Hebrew cosmology, did not use the standard words for the grave or the underworld. He used a highly specific, chilling verb found nowhere else in the entire biblical canon. He used the word Tartaru. He stated that God cast the Watchers into Tartarus. In ancient Greek and Near Eastern mythology, Tartarus was not merely a place where bad people went when they died. It was the deepest, most suffocating abyss in the architecture of the cosmos. It was a subterranean prison located as far beneath Hades as the highest heaven is above the earth. It was a dimensional maximum security facility designed exclusively for the incarceration of rogue immortal titans. We find the parallel to this terrifying location in the opening verses of Genesis chapter 1. Before the Spirit of God brought order to the universe, the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. The Hebrew word for the deep is tehom. It represents the chaotic, unformed primordial waters of the abyss. It is a realm of absolute nothingness, a suffocating vacuum devoid of light, form, and divine order. When the Supreme Magistrate executed his judgment against Semyaza, Azazel, and the 200 Watchers who swore the oath on Mount Hermon, he did not annihilate them. Annihilation would be a swift, merciful end. Instead, he commanded his loyal archangels to bind them in chains of gloomy darkness. This was not a physical binding with iron shackles. You cannot bind a multidimensional spirit with metal. These chains were gravitational laws, strict dimensional restrictions forged by the Logos himself. The rebellious Watchers were violently stripped of their celestial authority, violently severed from the life-giving radiance of the divine presence, and plunged into the absolute sensory deprivation of the Tehom. They were locked in the black, crushing pressure of the subterranean abyss, buried beneath the roots of the mountains, condemned to exist in a state of paralyzing darkness until the final, apocalyptic day of ultimate judgment. And when the floodwaters of Noah eventually swept across the surface of the earth, violently drowning the biological abominations known as the Nephilim, a new, terrifying breed of entity was released into the atmosphere. The Book of Enoch and early Jewish theology explicitly teach that when the physical bodies of the Nephilim were destroyed in the deluge, their hybrid spirits could not ascend to heaven, nor could they peacefully descend into the standard realm of the human dead. They were illegitimate, they were glitches in the cosmic system, and so, Their disembodied, ravenous spirits were condemned to wander the physical earth. They became the demons, the unclean spirits of the New Testament, forever seeking biological bodies to possess, perpetually hungering for the physical sensations they were violently denied by the floodwaters. This was the devastating fallout of the war in heaven, leaking onto the earth. The landscape of the ancient world was permanently scarred. The physical realm was now infested with the disembodied spirits of dead giants, and the deepest chambers of the abyss were filled with the shrieks of the incarcerated watchers. The justice of God had moved with devastating, unyielding precision. The cosmic courtroom had handed down its sentence. The angels who abandoned their post were imprisoned in darkness. The biological contamination of the Nephilim was eradicated by the waters of the deep. It seemed as though the divine order had been violently but successfully restored. The Supreme Magistrate had spoken, and the rebellion was crushed beneath the weight of his terrifying authority. But as the waters of the flood receded, and the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat, a deeply disturbing realization begins to take shape in the shadows of the biblical text. A terrifying inconsistency in the application of divine justice emerges. The watchers were bound in the suffocating darkness of Tartarus for interacting with the earth. The Nephilim were drowned for polluting the human bloodline. The judgment was absolute and merciless. And yet, the architect of the entire catastrophe, the shining cherub, the Nachash, who whispered the first treason in the garden, the entity whose pride fractured the divine council and initiated the entire cosmic war, remained free. Lucifer was not cast into the abyss with the watchers. He was not bound in chains of gloomy darkness. Long after the flood, long after the judgment of the Irin, we find him in the book of Job, casually strolling back into the throne room of God, taking his place among the divine council and maintaining his legal position as the prosecuting attorney of the universe. He still possessed his blistering intellect. He still possessed his access to the earthly domain. He still commanded billions of loyal, unfallen entities who had quietly pledged their allegiance to his silent coup. Why? Why did the perfectly just Supreme Magistrate brutally incarcerate the subordinates, but grant legal immunity to the mastermind? Why did the Logos, who holds all things together, lock the watchers in the deepest blackness of the primordial waters, while allowing the covering cherub to continue prowling the earth, prosecuting humanity, and maintaining his seat in the heavenly parliament? This glaring, terrifying discrepancy in the application of divine law is not a mistake in the ancient texts. It is the absolute core of the cosmic mystery. It is a legal contradiction so profound that it threatens to unravel the very concept of a righteous God. It forces us to peer into the darkest, most complicated corners of cosmic jurisprudence, where the laws of the universe begin to work against themselves, and the silence of Christ takes on a completely different, infinitely more dangerous meaning. The glaring legal discrepancy that allowed the shining cherub to remain in the divine council, while the watchers shrieked in the suffocating blackness of the abyss, is the very paradox that shatters our naive understanding of the spiritual realm. To reconcile this, we must completely dissect the horrifying precision of cosmic jurisprudence. We must understand the terrifying mechanics of free will. When the towering, unsleeping Irin descended upon Mount Hermon, they committed a crime of unauthorized dimensional transgression. They shattered the physical, biological, and technological firewalls that separated the celestial domain from the earthly plane. They forced their will upon the human race through sheer angelic power, breeding monstrosities and accelerating civilization into a mechanized bloodbath. Their crime was a direct, violent violation of the physical physics of creation. It required an immediate physical quarantine. The abyss, the crushing sensory deprivation of Tartarus, was the precise legal penalty for an unauthorized kinetic incursion. But Lucifer's crime in the Garden of Eden was fundamentally, chillingly different. The Nachash did not cross a forbidden dimensional barrier. He was already stationed in Eden as the covering cherub, the high priest of the cosmic mountain. He did not use angelic weaponry or physical force to subjugate humanity. He did not rape the earth. He simply whispered. He weaponized the most dangerous, unstable element in the entire universe, human autonomy. God had executed an irrevocable, legally binding charter granting mankind total dominion over the physical earth. It was a sovereign decree from the supreme magistrate, and God, in his absolute perfection, cannot violate his own word. When Adam and Eve listened to the enchantments of the Shining One, when they willingly consumed the forbidden element and absorbed the fractured logic of the rebellion, they did not just break a moral rule. They executed a devastating legal transaction. They utilized their God-given sovereignty to voluntarily elect a new sovereign. They handed the cosmic deed of the earthly province directly to the adversary. Because Lucifer obtained this dominion through the explicit, voluntary consent of the authorized human rulers, his usurpation was technically and terrifyingly legal within the framework of divine jurisprudence. God could not simply reach down and violently vaporize the serpent without simultaneously violating his own decree of human free will. To crush Lucifer by sheer omnipotent force would be to declare that the sovereignty he had gifted to mankind was a fraud. It would prove to the billions of observing celestial entities that God's system of governance was flawed, that free will was an illusion, and that the universe was ultimately ruled by arbitrary tyranny rather than perfect law. Lucifer knew this. His genius was not in overpowering God. His genius was in using the absolute perfection of God's own legal system as an impenetrable shield against God's wrath. By operating exclusively through the legal proxy of human consent, the prosecuting attorney of the universe secured his own immunity. He legally annexed the earth, transforming it into a rogue province of the spiritual empire. And because he held the legal title granted by humanity, he retained his right to stand in the heavenly parliament and accuse the very mud creatures who had crowned him. This is the agonizing doctrinal paradox that modern theology actively suppresses. The Church prefers to preach a comforting, simplified narrative where God is entirely in control of every earthly event, and the devil is merely a chained dog. But the ancient scriptures paint a far more terrifying picture. They reveal a world legally handed over to darkness, a universe where God intentionally limits his own interventions to respect the terrifying weight of human choice. And humanity's disastrous choices did not end in Eden. The infection of rebellion metastasized, culminating in an event so catastrophically destructive that it permanently altered the geographical and spiritual architecture of the world. We must investigate the true horror of the Tower of Babel. We are taught in Sunday schools that Babel was a story about arrogant humans trying to build a tall brick tower to reach the clouds, and God, annoyed by their architectural hubris, magically scrambled their languages. This is a pathetic, infantile reading of a profound cosmic disaster. To the ancient Mesopotamian mind, the structure being built on the plains of Shinar was not a skyscraper. It was a ziggurat. In the ancient Akkadian language, the concept of Babel translates to Babilu, the gate of the gods. A ziggurat was an artificial cosmic mountain. Remember that in ancient theology, mountains were the intersecting points between the divine and human realms. Eden was the original, flawless mountain of God. After humanity was exiled from the garden, and after the catastrophic deluge wiped out the Nephilim, the surviving human civilization gathered in direct defiance of God's command to scatter and fill the earth. Instead, led by the spirit of the fallen age, they attempted to artificially recreate Eden. They attempted to build a localized, controlled portal to the spiritual realm. The ziggurat was a machine of ritualistic sorcery, designed not for humans to climb up to heaven, but to forcibly pull the divine counsel down to earth. Humanity believed that through exact occult architecture and unified blood rituals, they could bind the Elohim to their own geographical location, manipulating the celestial entities to secure ultimate power and invincibility. The human race was actively attempting to formalize a permanent, localized alliance with the rebellious elements of the spiritual realm. They were trying to bypass the supreme magistrate entirely. The response of the Logos to this monumental act of treason was not a mere scrambling of dictionaries. It was the most severe, devastating theological judgment in the history of the ancient world. It was a cosmic divorce. To understand the absolute terror of this moment, we must examine the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9. If you read this passage in a standard modern translation based on the later Masoretic text, it states, "When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the children of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people." This translation presents a massive, glaring historical impossibility. At the time of the Tower of Babel, the nation of Israel did not exist. Abraham had not even been born. There were no children of Israel to number the nations by. The truth was intentionally buried. In the 1950s, when archaeologists unearthed the Dead Sea Scrolls, manuscripts 1,000 years older than the Masoretic text, they discovered the original terrifying wording of Deuteronomy 32. The ancient, uncorrupted Hebrew text reads, "When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of God." The sons of God, the Bene Elohim, the members of the divine council. At the Tower of Babel, God did not merely confuse human speech, he disinherited the human race. Because mankind had continually sought to worship and manipulate the lesser spiritual entities rather than the uncreated Creator, the Supreme Magistrate granted them their horrific desire. He mathematically divided the human population into 70 distinct nations, and he permanently assigned a high-ranking Elohim from his own divine council to rule over each specific territory. He handed the nations of the earth over to the administrative control of the angelic senate. And then, God stepped back. He withdrew his immediate presence from the geopolitical machinery of the world. He kept only one small, insignificant portion for himself, a singular bloodline that would eventually become Israel, starting with a solitary man named Abram. The rest of the globe was officially ceded to the jurisdiction of the cosmic bureaucrats. This is the terrifying origin of the ancient pagan pantheons. Zeus, Apollo, Baal, Chemosh, Molech, Ra, Odin. These were not imaginary fairy tales invented by primitive, superstitious farmers to explain thunderstorms and crop failures. These were the actual, literal sons of God. They were the 70 Elohim assigned at Babel to govern the nations. But as the silence of the Logos blanketed the earth, these territorial entities rebelled. They became intoxicated by the worship of the mud creatures. Instead of guiding the nations toward the ultimate truth of the Supreme Magistrate, these regional gods accepted the worship for themselves. They became violent, ravenous tyrants, demanding the construction of massive temples and the implementation of horrific, bloody laws. The Book of Psalms, specifically Psalm 106, explicitly states that the ancient Israelites, when they fell into idolatry, sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the Shadim. We translate Shadim weakly as demons, but in the ancient Near Eastern context, a Shadim was a territorial ruling spirit, an entity demanding the ultimate biological currency, human blood, to fuel its localized power. The world was carved into invisible geopolitical war zones, ruled by immortal warlords who manipulated human kings like disposable pawns on a blood-soaked chessboard. This invisible, jurisdictional warfare is explicitly detailed in the book of Daniel, chapter 10. The prophet Daniel engages in a grueling, 3-week period of fasting and prayer, seeking understanding regarding the future of his people. Finally, a terrifying celestial being, radiating blinding light and a voice like the roar of a multitude, manifests before him. The angel provides an explanation for his 21-day delay that completely annihilates the modern, pacified view of spiritual warfare. The entity says to Daniel, "The prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me because I was detained there with the king of Persia." This was not a human king resisting an angel. A human king, no matter how powerful his earthly military, cannot detain an immortal being composed of celestial fire for 3 weeks. The Prince of Persia was the specific, terrifying Elohim assigned to the territory of Persia at the Tower of Babel. This was a clash of cosmic titans, a literal, multi-dimensional war occurring directly above the earthly political theater. The angel then informs Daniel that as soon as he finishes delivering the message, he must return to the invisible front lines to fight the Prince of Persia again, and immediately after that, the Prince of Greece will arrive to do battle. The rise and fall of human empires, the dominance of the Babylonians, the conquest of the Medo-Persians, the sweeping military brilliance of Alexander the Great's Greek phalanxes, were merely the physical, bloody shadows of a violent, ongoing war within the fractured divine council. Human armies were simply the kinetic instruments used by the rebellious territorial gods to expand their jurisdictional boundaries. The Apostle Paul understood this terrifying reality perfectly. When he wrote his letter to the Ephesians, warning the early Christians about the true nature of their existence, he did not use vague, poetic language. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, he outlines the precise hierarchy of the enemy. He writes that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world. The original Greek word Paul uses for these powers is kosmokratoras. This is a specific, compound military term. Cosmos means the ordered world, and krator means ruler or lord. The kosmokratoras are the world rulers, the ancient territorial Elohim placed over the nations at Babel, the unseen dictators manipulating the geopolitical infrastructure of the entire planet. Paul is explicitly confirming that the earth is occupied territory, governed by a sophisticated, highly organized syndicate of rebellious divine beings. And yet, if this theology is so explicitly detailed in the ancient texts, if it is the very foundation of the biblical worldview, why has it been so violently suppressed? Why does the modern church treat the spiritual realm as a mere metaphor, reducing the devil to a red-suited cartoon and the war in heaven to a medieval fairy tale? The answer lies in a calculated, centuries-long campaign of intellectual cowardice and theological assassination by the early institutional church. In the first few centuries following the resurrection of Christ, the early church fathers, men like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Tertullian, taught this cosmic worldview openly. They understood the reality of the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the territorial gods. But as the church began to assimilate into the sophisticated philosophical culture of the Greco-Roman world, this raw, terrifying Hebrew theology became an embarrassment. It sounded too much like the pagan mythologies of the Greeks and Romans. It was too raw, too supernatural, too steeped in the blood and darkness of the ancient Near East. Furthermore, the church became terrified of dualism, the heretical idea that there were two equal gods fighting for the universe. To protect the absolute supremacy of Yahweh in the minds of the uneducated masses, theologians began to systematically sanitize the scriptures. The most devastating blow came in the 4th and 5th centuries through the towering influence of Augustine of Hippo. Augustine, seeking a cleaner, more philosophical theology, systematically dismantled the supernatural reading of the ancient texts. He declared that the sons of God in Genesis 6 were not angels, but merely the righteous human descendants of Seth, and the daughters of men were the unrighteous lineage of Cain. He spiritualized the divine council, reducing the terrifying Elohim of Psalm 82 to mere human judges or corrupt magistrates. This Augustinian sanitization acted as a theological lobotomy. It severed the modern Western mind from the ancient supernatural reality of the scriptures. Scribes intentionally altered texts like Deuteronomy 32, replacing the sons of God with the children of Israel, burying the cosmic divorce of Babel under layers of safe, nationalist history. The Book of Enoch was stripped of its canonical respect, pushed into the shadows as a bizarre, apocryphal fantasy. The modern church was left with a Bible that had been violently stripped of its multidimensional context, resulting in a shallow, impotent theology that cannot explain the sheer scale of global evil, the brutal reality of spiritual warfare, or the terrifying silence of God. By blinding humanity to the reality of the Kosmokratoros, the religious institutions unwittingly accomplished the ultimate objective of the Nachash. they convinced the world that the prison guards did not exist. This massive doctrinal paradox, the realization that the earth is legally owned by the prosecuting adversary and geographically divided among violent, rebellious territorial spirits, creates a state of absolute, suffocating despair. The cosmic legal contract forged in Eden and finalized at Babel is, by the very laws of divine jurisprudence, unbreakable. God cannot simply overwrite human free will to take the earth back, and he cannot violate his own decree assigning the nations to the lesser gods. The uncreated creator is legally bound by his own flawless justice. The human race is trapped in a cosmic hostage situation. The earthly domain is a spiritually radioactive wasteland, overseen by ancient, hostile intelligences that feed on human conflict, religious delusion, and biological suffering. The rebellious Elohim have built an impenetrable, decentralized empire of false religions, corrupt political systems, and material distractions, ensuring that humanity remains entirely blind to its own enslavement. The impasse is absolute. The law of the universe dictates that what was legally lost by a human must be legally reclaimed by a human. The deed to the earth can only be held by a member of the biological species to which it was originally granted. But every single human being born into the physical plane carries the spiritual genetics of the rebellion. Every human mind is infected with the virus of autonomy introduced by the shining cherub. Because every human is inherently guilty of cosmic treason, no human possesses the legal standing to challenge the adversary in the divine court. The prosecuting attorney simply points to our inherent corruption, validating his right to rule us, to torment us, and ultimately to drag us into the abyss with him. The silence of the Logos stretches across millennia, hanging heavily over the blood-soaked altars of the Canaanites, the imperial slaughterhouses of Rome, and the mechanized wars of the modern era. The cosmic gears of justice are locked in a fatal stalemate. The adversary has mathematically checkmated the supreme magistrate using the very laws of heaven, unless the architecture of reality itself could be weaponized, unless the uncreated creator could find a way to enter the biological matrix without violating the legal boundaries of the cosmos. The solution to the greatest legal paradox in the history of existence would require a maneuver so dangerous, so violently humiliating, and so structurally complex that it remained completely hidden from the blistering intellect of the covering cherub and the territorial gods. It would require the ultimate infiltration. The stalemate of the cosmos, the unbreakable legal fortress constructed by the shining cherub, demanded a solution that defied the very architecture of reality. The uncreated creator could not destroy the rebel forces without violating his own flawless justice. The earth could only be legally reclaimed by a biological human, but the entire human lineage was spiritually radioactive, contaminated by the treason of Eden. And so the supreme magistrate executed a maneuver of such terrifying complexity and profound humiliation that the ancient territorial gods, for all their blistering intellect, were entirely blinded to it. The Logos, the binding geometry of the universe, the entity who held the fiery stones of the cosmic mountain together, violently compressed his infinite essence. He engaged in the ultimate act of cosmic infiltration. He bypassed the corrupted genetic lineage of human rebellion by entering the physical matrix through the biological womb of a virgin. He was born not as a glowing, multi-dimensional entity of fire, but as a fragile, bleeding, mortal mud creature. He inserted himself directly into the contested territory, deliberately placing himself under the jurisdiction of the hostile Cosmocratorus, the world rulers who claimed legal ownership over every human soul. The Apostle Paul describes this terrifying operation in his letter to the Philippians, stating that Christ emptied himself. The original Greek word is kenosis. It does not mean he ceased to be God. It means he voluntarily stripped himself of his celestial privileges, his cosmic immunity, and his blinding glory, reducing himself to the legal status of a slave within the occupied province of Earth. For 33 years, the Logos operated behind enemy lines. He walked the dust of the ancient Near East as a perfect, uncorrupted biological human, fulfilling every single meticulous requirement of the divine law that the rest of humanity had shattered. He was the only human who did not possess the legal virus of autonomy. He never yielded his sovereignty to the adversary. And because he was completely innocent under the architecture of cosmic jurisprudence, the prosecuting attorney had no legal right to execute him. Death, the penalty explicitly reserved for treason, had no jurisdiction over the Logos, but the shining cherub and the territorial gods, blinded by their age-old arrogance and their insatiable thirst for human blood, could not perceive the legal trap that had been set for them. They saw only a human, a rabbi, a political nuisance disrupting their localized religious monopolies. And so, they orchestrated his execution. They manipulated the human geopolitical machinery, the religious elite of Jerusalem, and the brutal military apparatus of the Roman Empire to publicly torture and crucify the incarnate Word. When the physical heart of Jesus of Nazareth stopped beating on the execution stake at Golgotha, the rebellious Elohim believed they had won the ultimate victory. They believed they had successfully assassinated the heir to the cosmos, cementing their eternal ownership of the earth. But in the cold, brutal mechanics of divine law, their victory was their absolute, catastrophic undoing. By murdering an innocent human who possessed no legal guilt, the Cosmocratoras violated the foundational law of death itself. They committed the ultimate, indefensible act of cosmic malpractice. The Apostle Paul reveals the staggering legal consequence of the crucifixion in Colossians chapter 2, verse 15. He writes, "And having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross." The Greek verb used for disarmed is apekdousemenos. It is a violent military term that means to violently strip a defeated enemy of their armor, their weapons, and their badges of rank. The cross was not a tragic defeat. It was the ultimate cosmic ambush. The moment the innocent blood of the Logos touched the cursed earth of the physical plane, the legal contract forged in Eden shattered. The deed of ownership held by the shining cherub was nullified. The prosecuting attorney was instantly disbarred, stripped of his right to accuse humanity before the supreme magistrate, because the penalty for human treason had been fully absorbed by the uncreated Creator himself. This catastrophic legal reversal triggered the fulfillment of the most terrifying prophecy directed at the divine council. We must return to the explosive courtroom scene of Psalm 82. After condemning the territorial gods for their corruption, their thirst for blood, and their manipulation of the nations, the supreme magistrate issues their final, eternal sentence in verse 7. He says, "But you will die like mere mortals. You will fall like every other ruler." This is a decree of unparalleled cosmic violence. God declares that these ancient, towering, multidimensional entities, beings composed of pure, unaging celestial energy, will be subjected to the most degrading, humiliating fate imaginable for an immortal spirit. They will experience death. They will be unmade. Their immortality has been legally revoked. The cross initiated their execution sequence. The territorial gods of Babel are currently operating on borrowed time. They are dead entities walking, frantically clinging to the geopolitical machinery of a world they no longer legally own. And this is where the ancient, bloody history of the biblical narrative crashes violently into our present, modern reality. If the legal rights of the rebellious Elohim were revoked at the crucifixion, why does the world remain a theater of unspeakable horror? Why is the earth still drowning in disease, warfare, ideological madness, and systematic cruelty? Because an eviction notice requires enforcement. The current age, the era we are living in right now, is the agonizing, hyper-violent interlude between the signing of the legal decree and the physical arrival of the executing army. The Cosmocratoras know that their eternal sentence in the abyss is guaranteed. They know the suffocating blackness of Tartarus is waiting to swallow them. And like a desperate, cornered military dictator who realizes his regime is collapsing, they have adopted a scorched earth policy. If they cannot keep the earthly province, they are determined to burn it to ashes and drag as many human souls into the void with them as possible. The invisible warfare has not ceased. It has decentralized. It has become hyper-sophisticated. The territorial gods no longer demand that we build towering stone ziggurats or sacrifice our children on the burning bronze altars of Molech. They do not need primitive statues anymore. They have embedded themselves into the very infrastructure of modern civilization. They operate through the algorithms that dictate our perception of reality, through the sterile, fluorescent corridors of global finance, and through the weaponized ideologies that violently fracture human societies. The modern world is utterly saturated in the ancient enchantments of the Nachash. We are drowning in a digital, pharmaceutical, and psychological sorcery designed specifically to keep the human mind paralyzed, distracted, and entirely blind to the encroaching apocalyptic horizon. The Book of Revelation is not a symbolic, hallucinogenic poem about the struggle between good and evil. It is a precise, terrifying, prophetic blueprint of the eviction process. It is the tactical manual for the final, physical reclamation of the earth. In Revelation chapter 5, the Apostle John is pulled into the dimensional control room of the universe. He sees the supreme magistrate holding a scroll sealed with 7 seals. In Roman legal practice, a document sealed with 7 wax seals was not a letter. It was a title deed. It was a binding, irrefutable contract of ownership, specifically detailing the rightful heir to an estate. The Apostle John begins to weep uncontrollably because no one in heaven, on earth or under the earth, is found legally worthy to break the seals. If the seals remain unbroken, the earth remains perpetually trapped in the scorched earth campaign of the rebel gods. But then, the Logos steps forward, not as the bleeding, humiliated carpenter, but as the resurrected, glorified God-man. He is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the only biological human who successfully conquered the legal machinery of death. He takes the scroll, and the entire prophetic timeline of the end of the age is dictated by the systematic, violent breaking of those 7 seals. Each broken seal is not merely a disaster. It is a calculated, devastating blow to the infrastructure of the fallen Elohim. It is the uncreated creator systematically dismantling the artificial demonic grid that has enslaved the physical earth since the Tower of Babel. But as the final eviction draws near, the ancient texts warn of a horrific, cyclical repetition of history. Jesus himself issues a terrifying prophecy in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, verse 37. He states clearly, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." Modern preachers lazily interpret this to mean that people will simply be living their normal lives, eating, drinking, and ignoring God until the end arrives. But to a first-century Jewish audience, the days of Noah did not represent apathy. The days of Noah represented the ultimate, catastrophic breach of the dimensional barrier. It represented the descent of the Watchers. It represented genetic tampering, the violent hybridization of human DNA, the introduction of forbidden celestial technology, and the complete suffocating demonic saturation of the earthly plane. Christ is explicitly warning that the end of the age will witness a massive, terrifying recurrence of the Genesis 6 incursion. The boundaries between the physical dimension and the spiritual realm will disintegrate. We are not just facing geopolitical instability or ecological collapse. We are facing a severe, literal invasion of multi-dimensional hostility. The prophet Daniel warned that in the last days, the iron would mix with the clay, but they would not cohere. Ancient rabbinic scholars understood the iron as the celestial angelic element, and the clay as the biological human element. A final, desperate attempt by the rebellious entities to merge the spiritual and physical realms to create a transhuman, hybridized army capable of resisting the physical return of the Logos. This terrifying escalation reaches its absolute apex in Revelation chapter 9. The text describes a star that has fallen from the sky to the earth, an entity who is handed the literal key to the shaft of the abyss. This is the Tehom. This is Tartarus, the very maximum security dimensional prison where the original rogue watchers were chained in gloomy darkness thousands of years ago. The text states that the shaft is opened and smoke billows out of the abyss like the smoke from a gigantic furnace, darkening the sun and sky. From this suffocating primordial blackness, a swarm of apocalyptic entities is released upon the physical earth. They are commanded by an ancient, terrifying king, the Angel of the Abyss, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek, Apollyon, the Destroyer. The ancient, ravenous things that have been violently incarcerated since the floodwaters of Noah receded are going to be unleashed. The earth will become a literal, physical battleground, overrun by entities whose sheer, alien horror defies biological comprehension. The cosmic gears of judgment are currently grinding toward this precise, inescapable intersection. The silence of Christ that allowed Lucifer's rebellion to fester in the ancient past is about to be replaced by a roar that will shatter the foundational pillars of the earth. The sky will be rolled up like a scroll. The territorial gods, the cosmocratoras, the princes of the nations, will watch in absolute, paralyzing terror as the veil between dimensions is violently torn open. The legal immunity they hid behind for millennia has expired. The courtroom has adjourned. The verdict has been sealed. The executioner is already at the door. And as the modern world continues to dance mindlessly on the edge of the abyss, sedated by the digital enchantments of the shining cherub, oblivious to the towering, invisible architectures of judgment closing in from all sides, we have constructed a global psychological fortress to protect ourselves from the horrifying scale of the cosmos. We build cities of concrete, illuminate our nights with artificial neon, and stare obsessively into glowing screens, desperate to convince ourselves that the physical plane is the only reality that matters. We have domesticated the concept of God, reducing the uncreated creator to a harmless, grandfatherly figure whose sole purpose is to validate our emotional well-being and ensure our biological comfort. But this is the ultimate, fatal delusion. The ancient Hebrews possessed a word that the modern religious institutions have violently attempted to erase from our vocabulary. That word is yira. Modern theologians lazily translate it as reverential awe or deep respect, stripping it of its teeth. But in the ancient Near Eastern context, yira does not mean a polite, religious respect. It means absolute, paralyzing terror. It is the raw, physiological panic that grips a frail biological organism when it suddenly realizes it is standing in the presence of an overwhelming, lethal, and entirely uncontrollable power. To understand the severity of the spiritual realm, we must look at how the ancient world practically interacted with the localized divine presence. During the Second Temple period, the Jewish high priest was required to enter the innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies, once a year, on the Day of Atonement. The historical records of the Mishnah and the accounts of first-century historians, like Flavius Josephus, detail a terrifying protocol. The Holy of Holies was not merely a quiet room for prayer, it was the earthly epicenter of God's radioactive holiness. The high priest did not enter with a casual, familiar attitude. He entered with suffocating dread. Historical traditions record that a rope was tied around the ankle of the priest before he stepped through the massive, heavy veil. The reason is chilling. The uncreated energy of Yahweh is entirely incompatible with human impurity. If the priest harbored a single unconfessed infraction, a single hidden violation of the cosmic law, the sheer voltage of the divine presence would instantly execute him. The rope was necessary to drag his corpse out of the chamber, because no other human being could legally cross the threshold to retrieve the body without suffering the exact same violent disintegration. God is not safe. The spiritual realm is not a playground. It is a hyper-lethal environment governed by laws of physics that we cannot even begin to comprehend. When the ancient prophets were granted a brief, agonizing glimpse behind the dimensional veil, their reaction was never one of joy or comfort. In Isaiah chapter 6, the prophet is suddenly exposed to the throne room of the supreme magistrate, surrounded by the burning serpentine seraphim whose voices shake the structural foundations of reality. Isaiah does not raise his hands in joyful worship. He collapses in sheer existential panic. He cries out, "Woe to me! I am ruined!" The original Hebrew word he screams is nidmeti. It is a violent, terminal verb. It means to be cut off, to be utterly destroyed, to be silenced in death. Isaiah, one of the most righteous men of his generation, looks at the flawless, terrifying machinery of the divine court and instantly realizes his own biological corruption. He realizes that a creature made of mud and infected with the virus of autonomy has absolutely no right to exist in the presence of a God composed of consuming fire. This is the cold, unyielding reality of our mortal condition. We are fragile, dying organisms, walking blindfolded through an invisible war zone. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Hebrews, chapter 10, verse 31, delivers a statement that should completely shatter the fragile arrogance of the modern mind. He writes with terrifying surgical precision, "It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God." The Greek word used for terrifying is phoberon. It does not imply a gentle correction. It signifies something that induces absolute dread, a horror that causes the mind to recoil in panic. We are hurtling toward a courtroom where our earthly credentials, our bank accounts, our societal status, and our fragile human philosophies will instantly vaporize. We will stand naked before an intellect so vast and a justice so perfectly brutal that it did not spare the towering immortal watchers from the suffocating blackness of Tartarus. If the supreme magistrate did not hesitate to violently unmake the angels who possessed a fraction of his own celestial power, the arrogant assumption that he will somehow bend his cosmic laws to accommodate the ignorance of mankind is the height of biological insanity. The silence of Christ during the genesis of Lucifer's rebellion was not an act of passivity, nor was it a sign of weakness. It was the terrifying, calculated patience of a sovereign architect who allows the cancer to fully expose itself before he completely excises it from the body of creation. The eviction notice has been signed in blood. The territorial gods of the nations, the ancient, ravenous entities that have manipulated the rise and fall of human empires, know that their execution is mathematically inevitable. The countdown has already begun. The dimensional barriers are fracturing. The suffocating darkness of the abyss is preparing to disgorge its ancient prisoners for the final, apocalyptic conflict. We are standing on the precipice of a cosmic collision that will violently overwrite the physical laws of the earth. There is no comfort to be found in the shadows of this ancient theology. There is only the crushing weight of eternity and the terrifying realization of our own absolute helplessness. You cannot negotiate with the world rulers. You cannot outsmart the prosecuting attorney of the universe, and you cannot stand before the consuming fire of the uncreated creator on your own merit without being instantly reduced to ash. The celestial gears are turning. The cosmic courtroom is demanding its final settlement. As you close your eyes tonight, strip away the artificial lights and the comforting illusions of this dying age. Listen to the silence. It is not empty. It is the heavy, suffocating pause before the supreme magistrate finally speaks, and the fiery stones of the mountain of God come crashing down upon the earth.